The words, when they came, were not spoken in anger. They were delivered with the cold, precise cruelty of a stiletto blade sliding between ribs. "Christmas dinner is for family," my daughter Lena said, her voice cutting through the polite murmur of conversation. She paused, letting the silence curdle, her eyes locked on mine. She then turned her gaze to Julian, the man beside her, and smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Real family." The declaration of war was made. The battle lines were drawn right down the center of my antique mahogany dining table. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. I first noticed it in the way he held his fork. A small thing, a micro-expression of a flawed upbringing, an insignificant breach of etiquette to most. But to me, it was a critical data point. My Christmas table is a system of perfect order, a universe of my own design. The heirloom silverware, heavy and ornate, is placed with geometric precision, a hair's breadth from the edge of the charger. The baccarat crystal is polished to a flawless light-fracturing gleam. Even the conversation is managed, guided with the same subtle invisible pressures I used to steer a hostile board meeting toward a predetermined conclusion. It is a production, a performance of tradition and power, and every element is under my absolute control. And this man, Julian, was a disruption in the code. A bug. A liability Lena had willfully inserted into my most sacred annual tradition. He held his fork like a shovel, a crude, American-style affectation that grated against the continental standard I had drilled into my children since they could first hold a utensil. His suit, while well-intentioned, was clearly off the rack, the fabric a touch too shiny under the warm light of the crystal chandelier, the shoulders imperfectly squared. He spoke with the earnest, slightly too loud cadence of a man convinced of his own righteousness, a man who saw conviction as a substitute for refinement. Every detail about him was an offense, a small act of defiance against the world I had meticulously constructed. My gaze, cold and analytical, shifted from his offending hand to my daughter's face. She was watching me, her expression a mask of feigned innocence. But I could see the glint of defiance in her eyes, the subtle tension in her jaw. She was not just observing my reaction, she was anticipating it. She had brought this man here not in spite of his flaws but because of them. He was not a guest, he was a message, a walking, talking prospectus of her rebellion. She had assessed my values and deliberately chosen their inverse, packaged him in a cheap suit, and placed him at my table as a declaration of her own independence. The dinner had been a minefield of polite, coded hostilities. Julian had attempted to engage me in a discussion about community-led housing initiatives, a topic he knew was in direct opposition to the Sinclair Group's core business model of luxury urban development. His arguments were filled with passion and poorly researched data, the usual bleeding heart rhetoric that collapses under the first breath of financial scrutiny. I had parried his every point with a disarming plastic smile, and a few pointed questions about the long-term solvency of his nonprofit. I was not arguing with him. I was dissecting him, laying his operational weaknesses bare for all to see. Through it all, Lena had watched, her silence a coiled spring. She had wanted a confrontation, a dramatic explosion that would validate her sense of righteous rebellion. But I had refused to give it to her. My power did not come from shouting matches, it came from a control so absolute, so serene that it rendered such displays unnecessary. I would not be goaded, I would simply let the system run its course, confident that it would identify and neutralize the threat. But I had underestimated the depths of her resolve. I underestimated the sheer, theatrical poison she was willing to introduce into the system. Seeing that her initial gambit had failed to provoke the desired reaction, she changed tactics. She decided to move from a subtle infiltration to a direct assault. I chose to de-escalate, to make one final dismissive gesture of control. I turned my full attention to him, my smile never wavering. "Julian," I began, my voice a silken thread of condescension, "I hear your firm is trying to halt the waterfront development. A noble, if misguided endeavor. One must admire the passion, even if the economics are fanciful." It was a warning shot, a gentle but unmistakable reminder of the vast, unbridgeable chasm between our worlds. A reminder that while he played in the sandbox of protest and petitions, I moved the mountains he was trying to save. He opened his mouth to respond, likely with some impassioned defense of his work. But it was Lena who returned fire. I saw the decision flicker in her eyes. The choice to burn the bridge, the fortress, and the entire kingdom to the ground. A slow, deliberate sneer curled her lip. A shockingly ugly expression that transformed her beautiful, carefully sculpted face into something foreign and venomous. She placed her hand on Julian's, a gesture of performative alliance. Her eyes locked onto mine. "Christmas dinner is for family," she said, her voice dripping with a carefully rehearsed venom that chilled the air around the table. She paused, letting the word hang in the air, a guillotine blade suspended over the festive scene. "Real family." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. The polite murmur of conversation around the table, the gentle clinking of silverware, the low hum of small talk between my cousins and their spouses died instantly. The silence that followed was absolute. A vacuum where the festive atmosphere had been just moments before. Every eye was fixed on Lena, then on me. A grenade had been rolled onto the polished mahogany, its pin pulled. They were all waiting to see if I would let it detonate. My face remained a placid mask. Inside, however, the gears of a vast and complex machine began to turn. The insult was not the primary data point. The primary data point was the public nature of the attack. This was not a private rebellion, it was a public execution. She had chosen this stage, on this day surrounded by the peripheral members of the clan, to make her stand. It was a strategic, deliberate act of war, and it required an immediate, overwhelming response. I did not raise my voice. I did not acknowledge the gasp from my sister across the table. I simply placed my fork and knife down on my plate, perfectly parallel, a small final gesture of order. Then I turned my calm, unblinking gaze not to my daughter but to the man she had chosen as her weapon. "An interesting sentiment, Julian," I said, my voice as cool and smooth as the chilled Chardonnay in my glass. "Tell me, what is your definition of a real family? As a sociologist of sorts, I'm sure you have a working theory." Julian, to his credit, did not flinch. He was out of his depth, a minnow in a shark tank, but he had the courage of his convictions. "I believe family is about unconditional love and support," he said, his voice steady. "It's about accepting people for who they are, not what they can provide." "Might I?" "A beautiful, if somewhat romantic notion," I replied, my smile unwavering. I took a slow, deliberate sip of wine. "But let's apply that to a practical framework. Your nonprofit, the People's Foundation, I believe it's called, it runs on donations, correct? On the conditional support of others who believe in your mission." He narrowed his eyes, sensing the trap. "That's different. That's a professional enterprise." "Is it?" I countered, letting my gaze drift around the table. "Everything is a professional enterprise, Julian. Family, more than any other. A family is the first corporation we ever join. It requires investment. It expects a return. It has a shared legacy to protect. Unconditional love is a lovely theory, but it doesn't pay the mortgage on a multi-generational estate. It doesn't fund the trusts that will educate our grandchildren. Loyalty, contribution, a shared vision. Those are the load-bearing walls of a legacy. Love is the decorative wallpaper." "I couldn't disagree more," he shot back, his voice rising slightly. "You see people as assets on a balance sheet. I see them as human beings. Your waterfront development, for instance. You call it progress. I call it the systematic displacement of hundreds of families who can no longer afford to live in their own neighborhoods. Is that your idea of protecting a legacy, erasing someone else's?" The air crackled with tension. This was precisely the confrontation Lena had wanted. I could see the triumphant glint in her eye, but she had miscalculated. She thought I would be embarrassed by this public airing of my business practices. She did not understand that I had no shame. I had only objectives. "Someone always has to move, Julian," I said calmly. "That is the fundamental nature of progress. Stagnation is death. A city, like a company, like a family, must either grow or it will wither. You are fighting to preserve a moment in time that is already gone. I am building the future. It is a messy, often unpleasant business. But it is necessary." "It's not necessary, it's greedy," Lena interjected, her voice sharp and high. She could no longer contain herself. "You call it a legacy, I call it a monument to your own ego. You don't care about family, you care about the name, the brand. Julian is more my family than anyone at this table because he loves me for me, not for my stock options or my seat on the board." Her voice was trembling with a rage that had been simmering for years. It was a raw, ugly, artless display of emotion. It was a catastrophic misstep. She had abandoned the high ground of ideological debate, and descended into a personal childish tantrum. I let her words hang in the air, allowing their sheer unrefined venom to sink in. I looked at the shocked faces of my relatives. I looked at Julian, who now had an expression of profound discomfort. He had signed up for a debate, not a family immolation. Finally, I turned my gaze back to Lena. My voice, when I spoke, was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried the chilling weight of a final judgment. "Thank you for the clarification, Lena," I said. "It's important that everyone understands their position." I then picked up my silverware, signaling that the conversation was over. The rest of the dinner was eaten in a silence so profound it was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket of dread. Lena had won her confrontation, and in doing so she had lost everything. She just didn't know it yet. The rest of the dinner was a masterclass in tension. The staff, impeccably trained, moved with a ghostly quiet, clearing plates and refilling water glasses without a word. My relatives, caught in the crossfire, made feeble attempts at neutral conversation. The weather, a recent art exhibit, the lamentable state of the theater, but each topic withered and died in the Arctic air. Lena sat in stony silence, her jaw set, a flush of defiant color high on her cheekbones. Julian looked as though he would rather be anywhere else on earth, occasionally shifting in his chair, the squeak of the leather unnaturally loud. I, for my part, was serene. I was no longer a participant in the evening's drama. I was an observer, a strategist calculating the fallout and planning the necessary response. The emotional component of the situation had been identified, isolated, and jettisoned. All that remained was the problem, and its inevitable, logical solution. Lena had presented me with a new set of terms for our relationship. I would accept them, and then I would enforce them with the full, unyielding power of the system I had built. When the dessert plates were cleared and the coffee was served, Lena pushed her chair back abruptly. "We should go," she announced to Julian, not asking. He nodded in eager agreement, his relief palpable. They stood, the scrape of their chairs a final, discordant note. The charade was over. We all rose as they made their way from the dining room. I led the procession to the grand foyer, a cavernous space of marble and dark wood, dominated by a sweeping staircase and a portrait of my late husband, a man who had understood, as I did, that a dynasty is a business above all else. This was the formal stage for all Sinclair family departures, a place of polite goodbyes and air kisses. I stood before my daughter, my expression a carefully constructed mask of maternal concern. "Drive safely, Lena," I said, my voice soft. "The roads can be icy this time of night." It was a final offered concession, a chance for her to retreat to soften the blow, to leave some small thread of connection intact. A strategically offered off-ramp. She ignored it completely. She looked me dead in the eye, her gaze filled with a cold, triumphant fire. She had drawn her sword, and she was not going to sheath it now. "Thank you for the meal, Vivian," she said. The use of my first name was the final, unforgivable transgression. In the Sinclair family, I was mother. To my employees, I was Mrs. Sinclair. To my peers, I was Vivian. By choosing that specific form of address, in this house, in this moment, she was reclassifying our relationship. She was demoting me from family to peer, from matriarch to a mere business associate. It was a declaration of severance, as final and binding as any legal document. She wasn't finished. She smiled, a thin, cruel slash of red lipstick. "Don't worry, you won't have to endure Julian again," she continued, her voice clear and carrying in the echoing space. "We'll be spending future holidays with a family built on love, not contracts." She then turned, taking Julian's arm, and walked towards the massive, oak front door. My butler, ever the professional, opened it for them, his face an impassive mask. A blast of frigid December air swept into the foyer. Lena didn't look back. She walked out of the house, out of the family, and out of the Sinclair Trust, pulling Julian along with her into the cold, dark night. The door closed with a heavy, definitive thud, the sound of a vault being sealed. My sister rushed to my side, her hand fluttering near my arm. "Vivian, I am so sorry," she began. "That was just—" I held up a hand, silencing her. I turned to face my remaining guests, my expression unchanged. "It appears my daughter is feeling unwell," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Now who would like a cognac in the library?" I had to maintain the system. I had to project unwavering strength. The family, the real family, needed to see that the foundations of their world were unshaken, that the defection of one faulty component had not, and would not compromise the integrity of the whole. But as I led them towards the library, my mind was already far away. It was in my office, running through checklists, accessing protocols and preparing the necessary directives. Lena had made her declaration. Now I would make mine. Hers was of words. Mine would be of action. The rest of the evening was a performance. I played the role of the gracious hostess, the unflappable matriarch. I poured the cognac, a rare 1952 Remy Martin, and guided the conversation toward the safe, neutral territory of global markets and philanthropic strategy. I was a picture of serene control, a marble statue of a woman unperturbed by the seismic event that had just occurred. My relatives, reassured by my composure, relaxed. The crisis had been contained. The system was stable. But beneath the surface of my calm, a parallel process was running, a cold and silent execution of a long-contemplated contingency plan. I was not reacting to Lena's declaration. I was activating a protocol that had been designed years ago for precisely this eventuality. I had always known that Lena's rebellious streak was not a phase. It was a fundamental flaw in her character, a systemic incompatibility with the world I had built. I had hoped it could be managed, corrected, or contained. Tonight, she had proven that it could not. The flaw was critical. The component had to be removed. I excused myself shortly after midnight, pleading the lateness of the hour. My guests departed, leaving the house in a profound, ringing silence. The staff glided through the rooms, restoring order, erasing the last traces of the evening's conflict. I did not go to my bedroom. I walked with a steady, unhurried pace to my home office. It is the heart of my empire, a soundproofed, glass-walled command center on the 3rd floor, overlooking the glittering sleeping city, the city I owned in more ways than one. I sat down in my leather command chair, the city lights a carpet of diamonds at my feet. The room was dark save for the cool blue glow of the multiple monitors that came to life at my touch. My desk was a vast, uncluttered expanse of polished steel and black granite. It was not a place of work, it was a place of power. I did not hesitate. There was no moment of reflection. No pang of maternal grief. Emotion was a liability, a corrupting influence on clear strategic thought. I had already processed the event, analyzed the data, and determined the optimal course of action. All that remained was execution. I made 3 calls using a secure encrypted line that was untraceable. The first was to David Chen, my chief legal counsel and a man who had been with me for 30 years. He answered on the first ring, his voice alert and professional, even at this hour. "David," I said, my voice a low, even monotone, protocol exile. There was a fractional pause on the other end of the line, just a beat of silence. He knew the protocol. We had drafted it together, a decade ago after Lena's first serious transgression at boarding school. It was the ultimate sanction, a financial and legal severance so total it was the modern equivalent of disownment. "Understood, Vivian," he replied, his voice devoid of surprise. "The target?" "Lena Sinclair," I said. The name felt foreign, the name of a stranger, a counterparty in a hostile negotiation. "And the timeline?" he asked. "Full effect by 0600 hours," I instructed. "I want it done before the sun rises." "It will be done," he said, and the line went dead. The second call was to Marcus Thorne, my head of security, a former MI6 agent. Thorne was a man of immense discretion and ruthless efficiency. "Thorne," I said, dispensing with the pleasantries. "I have a situation requiring asset retrieval." "Go ahead, Mrs. Sinclair." His voice was a gravelly whisper. "The penthouse at 1 Central Park West. The occupant's access is being revoked. I need a discreet team to enter the premises at 0500 hours. They are to retrieve specific high-value items. All art, all jewelry and all personal technology. A detailed inventory list is being sent to your secure terminal now. These are assets of the trust. The retrieval must be clean, quiet and legally airtight. A court order is being expedited by Chen's office as we speak. Consider it handled," Thorne said. "Will the occupant be present?" "That is not your concern," I replied. "Your concern is the assets. No interaction is necessary." "Understood," he said. The line clicked off. The third and final call was to the managing trustee of the Sinclair Trust. A stern, old money banker from a family that had managed the fortunes of empires for generations. "Mr. Albright," I said. "Vivian," he acknowledged. "To what do I owe the pleasure at this late hour?" "I am invoking Article 7, Section B of the Sinclair Trust Agreement." I stated, referring to the clause that gave me, as the founding matriarch, unilateral power to alter the line of succession in the event of a direct threat to the family's legacy. I am submitting a binding amendment. Lena Sinclair is to be reclassified from a primary heir to a tertiary beneficiary, effective immediately. Her inheritance is to be forfeited and absorbed back into the principal. Distribute her share proportionally between my son Marcus and the Sinclair Charitable Foundation. There was a longer pause this time. Albright was a man of tradition. This was a move of shocking brutality by even his standards. The paperwork will require your physical signature in the morning, Vivian, he said finally, his voice strained. It will be on your desk by 7 a.m., I replied. I ended the call. The directives were issued. The gears of the vast machine were turning. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the sleeping city. A light snow had begun to fall, the flakes swirling in the orange glow of the streetlights. It was beautiful, peaceful. Lena thought she had delivered the final word. She thought she had won. She did not understand. In my world, words were irrelevant. Only power mattered. And she had just voluntarily, foolishly abdicated all of hers. The sun would rise in 6 hours. And when it did, she would be a stranger. The first phase of the protocol was the cleanest. A silent, bloodless coup conducted in the sterile realm of ones and zeros. It was an erasure. For this, I needed no one's assistance. My terminal, the central nexus of my digital world, granted me administrative access to the entire Sinclair infrastructure. It was a power I rarely used directly, but its existence was a fundamental principle of my control. With a few keystrokes, I brought up the Sinclair Group's global employee and beneficiary database. A river of names, titles, and security clearances flowed across the screen. I typed in the target's name, Lena Sinclair. Her profile appeared, a constellation of data points that represented her life within my system. Her corporate accounts, her security credentials, her access permissions, her company-issued devices. It was her digital DNA, the architecture of her privilege. I began the purge. First, the financials. With a click, I accessed her portfolio of corporate credit cards. The Centurion Black Card, with its unlimited credit line, the Platinum Business Card, which she used for her so-called art consulting business. A vanity project I had funded, the Sinclair Executive Fuel Card. One by one, I clicked deactivate. A small red light, next to each account, blinked for green to off. The river of money that had flowed, unimpeded to her for her entire life, was dammed. Instantly. Next, communications. The Sinclair Group ran on its own encrypted proprietary network, a digital fortress called Aegis. It handled our secure emails, our instant messaging, our video conferencing. Lena's account was linked to her phone, her laptop, her tablet. I entered the command revoke access SF. LS Sinclair. The system asked for confirmation. I typed Y and pressed enter. The line of code executed in a nanosecond. Across the city, in her penthouse bedroom, her devices would have silently, seamlessly been excommunicated. She would receive no more secure messages. Her access to the family's private digital salon where we discussed business and strategy was gone. She was now on the outside of the firewall, a ghost in the public domain. Then, physical access. Every Sinclair property, from the corporate headquarters downtown to the summer home in the Hamptons, was controlled by a unified keycard system. Lena's profile showed her as having level 1 access, the highest level, equal to my own. I dragged her icon from the active column to the denied column. The system updated globally. The locks of her world had just been changed. The penthouse where she was sleeping would now be a cage she could not re-enter if she left. I moved through the checklist with a detached, methodical calm. Her corporate cloud storage, filled with her university papers and art project files, was archived and her access severed. Her subscription to the Sinclair Group's private jet charter service was terminated. Her name was removed from the door list at the exclusive social clubs where the family held memberships. Every thread that connected her to the vast tapestry of power and privilege I had woven was being cut, one by one. The process was intoxicating in its quiet, absolute power. This was a form of control far more profound than shouting or arguments. I was not banishing her with angry words. I was simply deleting her from the system that defined her reality. She believed her identity as Lena Sinclair was an innate fact, a matter of blood. She was about to learn that her identity as she knew it was a revocable set of permissions granted by me. The final step in the digital exile was the most symbolic. I accessed the private family server, the digital vault where we kept our history. Generations of photographs, home videos, scanned letters, genealogical records. It was the Sinclair legacy in terabytes. I found the folder labeled Lina. It contained thousands of images, from her first steps on the lawn of the estate to her graduation from Yale. I did not delete the folder. Deletion is an act of passion, of trying to erase a memory. I was not interested in erasing memory. I was interested in reclassifying it. I created a new encrypted deep archive folder. I named it Historical Asset LS, and I moved her entire life into it. She was no longer a living, breathing part of the family's present. She was an archived asset from its past, a historical record. I leaned back, my work complete. The clock on my screen read 03:17 a.m. The digital purge had taken less than an hour. Lina Sinclair, the privileged heiress, the defiant daughter, no longer existed. In her place was a young woman with a rapidly dwindling checking account, no credit, no access, and no institutional support. A ghost. I looked out at the city again. The snow was falling thicker now, blanketing the world in a pure, clean white. A fresh start. For the family. For the legacy. The system had been cleansed of its corruption. It was pure again. The digital purge was silent and invisible. The next phase was designed to be tangible. A physical manifestation of her new reality. Privilege. I had always believed is most keenly felt not in its presence but in its sudden and absolute absence. Lina had never known a moment of material want in her entire life. She was about to experience a crash course in the stark, unforgiving laws of ownership. The penthouse at 1 Central Park West was a jewel box I had acquired for her upon her graduation. It was not a gift. Gifts create an expectation of unconditional love, a concept I found to be fiscally and emotionally irresponsible. The penthouse was an asset of the Sinclair Trust, assigned to her for her use as long as she remained a beneficiary in good standing. She had in the last few hours spectacularly failed to meet that condition. At 04:30 a.m. I received a secure message from my legal counsel David Chen. The order is signed and sealed. Thorne has it. The wheels of the law, which grind so slowly for the common man, move with astonishing speed when lubricated by the kind of power I wielded. A sympathetic judge, woken from his sleep, had signed an emergency order granting the legal owner the trust immediate access to its property to secure its assets from a non-compliant occupant. It was all perfectly legal, ruthlessly efficient, and utterly unassailable. I switched one of my monitors to a secure encrypted feed. It was a live link to the body camera of one of Marcus Thorne's operatives. The screen was dark, the audio filled with the quiet hum of a luxury vehicle. Thorne's voice, a low gravel cut through the silence. Team Alpha, we are 5 minutes out, final confirmation. This is a non-confrontational retrieval. We are ghosts, in and out before the target is even aware. The objective is the inventory, nothing else. I watched a detached observer as the team assembled in the service corridor of the opulent building. They were not brutish thugs, they were quiet professionals in dark unmarked uniforms, carrying specialized equipment cases. The building's head of security, a man who received a generous Sinclair Group bonus every Christmas, met them and guided them to the penthouse service entrance, bypassing the doorman and any potential record of their visit. The body cam feed showed a gloved hand using a high-security key provided by the building to open the door. The team slipped inside, their movements swift and silent. The penthouse was dark, the only light the vast, glittering panorama of the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I had provided Thorne with a detailed inventory, complete with photographs and serial numbers. These were not Lina's personal trinkets. These were investments. The Picasso sketch in the foyer, the antique Cartier necklace I had allowed her to wear on special occasions, the custom-built Steinway piano in the living room. Each item was a registered asset of the trust. The feed was steady, professional. The team moved with a practiced, balletic grace. One operative carefully removed the Picasso from the wall, placing it into a climate-controlled art transport case. Another went to the master bedroom's walk-in closet. The camera focused on the velvet-lined drawers of the jewelry safe. The Cartier necklace was located, its diamonds glittering coldly in the operative's flashlight beam, and secured in a padded case. They moved through the apartment, their efficiency a thing of beauty. The laptops, the tablets, the high-end audio equipment, all provided by the Sinclair Group's IT department, all property of the company, were gathered and packed. They ignored her clothes, her books, the personal photographs on her bedside table. Those were worthless, sentimental clutter. They were there for the assets. The most significant retrieval was the car. The key fob for her Aston Martin, a custom silver DB11, was located on the kitchen counter. An operative took it and headed down to the private garage. The camera feed showed him approaching the gleaming vehicle. He pressed the fob, the car chirped its acknowledgement, and he slipped inside. The engine roared to life, a deep throaty sound that was the very definition of power. He backed the car out of its space and drove it out of the garage, into the pre-dawn darkness. The repossession was complete. By 05:48 a.m., the team was clear. The penthouse was stripped of anything of significant monetary value. They had left her the furniture, the clothes, the illusion of her life. But the foundation of that life, the vast invisible scaffolding of wealth that had supported it, was gone. The lead operative's camera did a final slow pan of the living room before they departed. The empty space on the wall where the Picasso had hung was a pale blank rectangle. It was a perfect metaphor, a ghost of a memory of a value that was no longer there. I closed the feed. The physical assets were secure. The message had been prepared. All that was left was for the sun to rise, and for Lena to wake up and discover that the world she knew had been repossessed while she slept. This was the final, most crucial act. The digital exile had stripped her of her present privileges. The seizure of assets had erased the material evidence of her status. But this was the masterstroke. This was about the future. It was about ensuring the purity and strength of the Sinclair line for generations to come. It was the amendment of the bloodline itself. A legacy, I have always maintained, is not a matter of sentiment. It is a structure, an edifice built to withstand the ravages of time, market fluctuations, and most importantly, the weaknesses of human character. The Sinclair Trust was the legal and financial embodiment of that structure. It was more than just a repository of wealth. It was the constitution of our family, the document that defined our purpose and our succession. At precisely 4:00 a.m., my screen chimed with an incoming secure video conference. One by one, the faces of my core legal team appeared in a grid. David Chen, his expression grim and resolute, two senior partners from his firm, specialists in trust and estate law, their faces etched with the weariness of a night without sleep, and a silent observing representative from Albright's Bank. There were no pleasantries. This was not a meeting, it was a dictation. "Good morning," I began, my voice clear and steady in the silent room. "You all have the preliminary draft of the amendment I sent an hour ago. We are here to finalize and execute it. The legal authority for this action is Article 7, Section B of the Sinclair Trust Agreement, which I am now formally invoking." I paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. Article 7, Section B was a clause of immense power. What my late husband had jokingly called the nuclear option. It granted the founding matriarch me the unilateral right to redefine the line of succession, if a designated heir was judged to have acted in a manner that constituted a direct and material threat to the long-term stability and reputation of the Sinclair legacy. Lena's public declaration of war, her alignment with a man ideologically opposed to our entire existence, was a textbook definition of such a threat. "The amendment is straightforward," I continued, looking into the camera with an unblinking gaze. "Lena Sinclair's status as a primary heir is hereby dissolved, effective immediately. Her name is to be struck from all core succession documents, including the primary charter and all related codicils." I could see the flicker of shock, even in these hardened legal minds. Stripping an heir of their inheritance was one thing. Erasing them from the very legal framework of the family was another. It was a level of repudiation that bordered on the medieval. "She will be reclassified," I stated, "as a tertiary beneficiary. This is a non-voting, non-inheriting status. It will grant her a small, court-mandated annual stipend, sufficient for basic living expenses. This is not an act of charity. It is a legal firewall to prevent any future claim of destitution or neglect against the trust. The amount will be determined by an independent arbiter, and it will be non-negotiable." One of the junior partners cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sinclair," he began hesitantly, "such a drastic reclassification, it could be challenged in court as punitive." David Chen shot him a look that could freeze fire. I answered before David could. "It will not be challenged," I said, my voice dropping to an icy calm, "because it is not punitive. It is a direct and logical consequence of her own stated position. Miss Sinclair declared, publicly, that she no longer considers herself part of this family. She has abdicated. This amendment is simply the legal formalization of her own resignation. We are honoring her choice." My framing was perfect. Legally and psychologically, I was not the aggressor. I was merely the administrator of her decision. Her forfeited inheritance, I continued, moving on, will not remain in a separate fund. It is to be absorbed back into the trust's principal. 50% of the forfeited assets will be reallocated to the portfolio of the remaining primary heir, my son Marcus Sinclair. The other 50% will be directed into the Sinclair Charitable Foundation, with a specific mandate for funding scholarships at the Wharton School of Business. We will turn her rebellion into a tool for fostering the next generation of capitalists. It was my final perfect insult. Her legacy would be to fund the education of the very people she and her lover claimed to despise. The documents are prepared, David Chen said, his voice bringing the meeting to a close. They only require your signature, Vivian. A courier is on his way to my location now. I replied. He will have the signed and notarized documents on Mr. Albright's desk by 7 a.m. See to it that the amendment is filed and sealed with the court by noon. I ended the conference call. The screen went blank. It was done. The structure was secure. The bloodline, the real bloodline, the one defined by loyalty and a shared vision, not by the mere accident of birth, was pure. Lena had been a faulty component, a weak link threatening the entire chain. I had not broken the chain. I had removed the weakness, making it stronger, more resilient, and more perfect than it had been before. The legacy was safe. That was the only thing that had ever mattered. The first sign of the new reality came at 8:15 a.m. Lena, a creature of habit, attempted to order a coffee and a croissant for delivery from her favorite artisanal bakery, a small daily luxury she took for granted, like the air she breathed. Her phone buzzed with the notification payment declined. Annoyed, she tried a different card. Payment declined. Confused, she tried the debit card linked to her personal checking account. Insufficient funds. This was not just an inconvenience. It was an impossibility. Her accounts were automatically replenished by the trust every month. They were never low, let alone empty. A flicker of unease, the first tremor of a coming earthquake, went through her. She decided to drive to the bank, to sort out what must be a simple if irritating technical glitch. She walked to the secure garage beneath her building, clicking the key fob for her Aston Martin. Nothing happened. She clicked it again. The car remained dark, silent. It was then she noticed it was not just unresponsive. It was gone. The parking space, her designated space, was starkly, shockingly empty. In its place, a small oil stain on the concrete, a ghost of what had been there. Now the unease was curdling into real panic. She ran back to the concierge desk in the lobby, her mind racing. My car, she said, her voice breathless. It's gone. Was it towed? The concierge, a man who had greeted her with fawning respect for 2 years, now looked at her with a cool, professional distance. There was no towing, Miss Sinclair, he said, avoiding her eyes. The vehicle was collected by the legal owner early this morning. The legal owner? I'm the owner, she insisted, her voice rising. Our records show the vehicle is leased by the Sinclair Trust, he replied, his tone flat. As for your other issue, an email was sent to you an hour ago from building management. Her hands trembling, she pulled out her phone and found the email. The subject line was chillingly direct. Notice to vacate. The body of the message was a cascade of legal jargon, but the meaning was clear. The ownership of Penthouse 48B had been legally transferred. The new owner did not wish to continue her tenancy. She had 24 hours to remove her personal belongings. The world began to tilt on its axis. This wasn't a glitch. This was an attack, a coordinated, systematic dismantling of her life. And there was only one person with the power to execute such a thing. Rage, pure and undiluted, replaced her panic. She stormed out of the building and hailed a taxi, a humiliating act in itself, and gave the driver the address of the family estate. The drive was a blur of frantic, unanswered calls to my personal number, to my assistant, to David Chen. Each call went straight to a placid, automated voicemail. She was locked out. She arrived at the estate, the grand imposing gates already swinging open in anticipation of her arrival. This, at least, was a small comfort. She was not yet barred from entry. She paid the driver with the last of the cash in her wallet and ran up the sweeping stone steps, not bothering to knock, and burst through the front door. She found me in the morning room, a beautiful glass-enclosed solarium that overlooked the snow-covered gardens. I was seated in a white wicker armchair, bathed in the crisp, pale light of the winter sunrise. A silver tray with a porcelain teapot and a single delicate cup sat before me. The scene was one of perfect, infuriating tranquility. What have you done? She screamed, her voice raw echoing in the quiet room. She was disheveled, her hair a mess, her face pale with a mixture of fury and disbelief. She was chaos invading my order. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my Darjeeling tea before answering. I placed the cup back on its saucer with a soft, barely audible click. I looked up at her, my expression not of anger but of mild, detached curiosity. I have no idea what you're talking about, Lena, I said, my voice calm and level. You seem distressed. Perhaps you should have a seat. Don't play games with me, she shrieked, taking a step closer. My cards are cut off. My car is gone. I'm being evicted from my own home. This is your doing. You have to fix it. Her hysteria was a stark contrast to my stillness. She was a storm and I was the unmovable rock against which she was breaking. I looked at her, this child who had never known a moment of hardship, now facing the first real consequence of her life. This was the moment. The culmination of all the night's work. This was the delivery of the message. The presentation of the bill for her transgressions. I let the silence stretch, allowing her to fully experience her own powerlessness. Then I spoke. I let her rage wash over me. A tidal wave of impotent fury. I did not interrupt her tirade. I simply watched, my expression unchanging. As she paced the length of the morning room, her voice echoing off the glass walls, she accused me of cruelty, of tyranny, of being a monster. The words were a predictable cocktail of adolescent melodrama and genuine shock. She was like a person who had willingly stepped off a cliff, now screaming at the ground for being so hard. When she finally ran out of breath, her chest heaving, her face streaked with tears of rage, I calmly placed my teacup back on its saucer. The small, sharp click of porcelain on porcelain cut through the tense silence. There is no confusion, Lena, I said, my voice as crisp and cool as the winter air outside. Everything that has happened is a direct and logical consequence of the terms you yourself established last night. She stared at me, her mouth agape, her eyes wide with incomprehension. What are you talking about? I didn't establish any terms. I just told the truth. Precisely. I agreed, my voice smooth as silk. You clarified your position with admirable, if artless honesty. You stood at my table in my home, and declared that Christmas dinner and by extension this family was for real family. You defined Julian, a man whose entire professional existence is dedicated to undermining our own, as a member of your real family. You then addressed me by my first name, formally reclassifying our relationship from one of familial hierarchy to one of peer-level disassociation. You concluded by stating your intent to spend your future with a family built on love, not contracts. I paused, letting each of my words sink in, each one a carefully placed stone in the wall I was building between us. I have done nothing more than honor your definition, Lena, I continued, my gaze steady and unwavering. The Sinclair Trust, the penthouse, the car, the credit lines, the inheritance, those are all a function of the contract. The contract you so publicly repudiated. They are the exclusive purview of the Sinclair family. By your own words, you chose to abdicate your position within that family. You resigned. I have simply accepted your resignation and processed the relevant paperwork. The color drained from her face. The fury in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. She was beginning to understand, not on an emotional level but on a structural one. She was beginning to see the bars of the cage she had never known existed. That's insane, she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. Family is about blood. You can't just fire me from the family. Can't I? I replied, raising a single perfectly sculpted eyebrow. You seem to be operating under the deeply flawed, sentimental assumption that family is a biological fact. It is not. It is a social and economic compact. It is a corporation with a shared bloodline, and you, my dear, have violated the terms of your employment in the most egregious manner possible. You sided with the competition, you attempted a hostile takeover of our core values, and you did it publicly. In any other corporation, you would have been escorted from the building by security. Consider this a more elegant termination. She stood there speechless, the foundations of her world crumbling to dust around her. She had thought she was fighting a battle of love versus money, of freedom versus control. She had not understood that she was fighting a war she had already lost, because she had never bothered to read the terms of engagement. She had brought a knife to a battle of corporate law, and I had responded with the full, overwhelming force of the entire legal and financial system. This isn't fair, she finally managed to say. her voice small, broken. I stood up, smoothing the front of my silk robe. I looked down at her, this broken, defeated child. Fairness, I said, my voice devoid of any warmth, is a concept for children's stories. This is the real world. A world of actions and consequences. You acted, these are the consequences. I suggest you adapt quickly. The fight went out of her, extinguished as completely as a snuffed candle. The rage, the defiance, the self-righteous fury. It all evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell. She looked around the sun-drenched room at the priceless art on the walls, the view of the sprawling, manicured estate, as if seeing it for the first time not as her home but as a foreign and hostile territory. She had been a princess in this castle her entire life, and in the space of a single morning she had become a trespasser. So that's it, she whispered, her voice cracking. 24 years, it all just ends? Because I brought a man you don't approve of to Christmas dinner. No, I corrected her, my voice precise and devoid of emotion. It ends because you declared war. The man was merely your choice of weapon. You fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the institution you were born into. Lena, you viewed your inheritance as a right. It was, and has always been, a privilege contingent upon your loyalty to the values that created it. You chose to publicly align yourself with a hostile ideology. You chose to repudiate the very structure that gave you your life. This is not my choice. This is the logical outcome of yours. She shook her head, a tear finally tracing a path down her pale cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, uncomprehending shock. Love. She stammered, the words sounding weak and pathetic in the vast, silent room. What about love? Aren't you my mother? I allowed a small, cold smile to touch my lips. It is because I was your mother that I gave you every advantage, every opportunity. I built an empire to secure your future. Your part of the contract was simple, to honor that legacy, to contribute to it, to protect it. You chose instead to try and burn it down. My role as the architect of this legacy supersedes my role as your mother. The survival of the system is always more important than the happiness of any single component. She had nothing left. No arguments. No leverage. No power. She had come here expecting a fight, an emotional confrontation she could win with tears and accusations. She had found herself in a boardroom facing a hostile termination she was powerless to stop. She had played the wrong game, with the wrong opponent, and she had been utterly, catastrophically outmaneuvered. I walked past her towards the door of the morning room. I paused beside her, close enough to see the utter devastation in her eyes. This was the moment of checkmate, the moment the opposing king is cornered with no moves left, the board irrevocably lost. I looked down at her, this stranger who had once been my daughter, stripped of her name, her wealth, her very identity, and I delivered the final devastating blow, using her own words as the blade. You were right, I said, my voice a soft, chilling whisper. Christmas is for real, family. I then turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing softly on the marble floor. I did not look back. I did not need to. The game was over. I had won. I left her standing alone in the vast, silent room, a ghost in the house she had once called home, to contemplate the true cost of her rebellion. The system was secure. The legacy was safe. The contract had been enforced. That was the only victory that mattered. The days that followed were silent. I received no more frantic calls, no tearful messages. Lena had vanished from my world, as completely as if she had never existed. But my system of information was vast and efficient. I did not need to speak to her to know the details of her new life. I simply had to read the reports. A week after the Christmas dinner, a discreet, single-page summary appeared on my secure tablet. It was from Marcus Thorne's surveillance team. They were not actively monitoring Lena. That would be an unnecessary expense. They had simply been tasked with confirming the outcome of my strategic maneuver. The report was concise and deeply satisfying. Lena had, as expected, moved in with Julian Marshall. The address was a small, third-floor walk-up apartment, in a neighborhood I had only ever seen from the tinted windows of my car on the way to the airport. The building was pre-war, which was a real estate euphemism for old and decaying. A photograph was attached. It was taken with a long-range lens, grainy but clear. It showed Lena and Julian at a budget grocery store. They were standing in the canned goods aisle and their body language spoke volumes. Lena was gesturing emphatically at a can of beans, her face a mask of frustration. Julian looked tired. His shoulders slumped, an expression of weary exasperation on his face. The caption beneath the photo was clinical: verbal altercation observed between subject and associate. I read the report with a kind of detached academic interest. It was the predictable, inevitable result of my calculations. Lena had spent her entire life in a world of frictionless existence. Her every need, every whim, was anticipated and met before she had even fully formed the desire. She did not know how to budget, how to compromise, how to exist in a world where resources were finite. Julian, on the other hand, had chosen a life of principled poverty. His non-profit salary, while noble, was a pittance. It was sufficient for one person living a Spartan life. It was comically, catastrophically inadequate for supporting a woman who considered custom-made shoes a basic necessity. I had not just exiled Lena, I had transferred her. She was no longer my liability. She was now his. I had handed him the beautiful, expensive, high-maintenance asset he claimed to love. And I had also handed him the bill. The full crushing weight of her upkeep was now on his shoulders. His unconditional love was about to be stress-tested by the harsh realities of utility bills and credit card debt. I imagined their conversations, Lena accustomed to the finest restaurants, now faced with the prospect of canned beans for dinner. Lena who had a personal stylist, now having to navigate a laundromat. Lena who had never flown commercial in her life, now having to contemplate a subway token. The pressure on their relationship would be immediate, immense, and relentless. He had wanted to be her hero, her savior from the cold, transactional world of her mother. Now he would be the one forced to say no. He would be the one imposing limits, the one managing budgets, the one who could not give her the world she had always taken for granted. He had, in a beautiful ironic twist of fate, been forced to become me, a pale, ineffectual, underfunded version of me. I filed the report away in the digital archive. In the folder labeled Historical Asset LS, it was just another data point, a confirmation that the system was working as designed. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the quiet, profound satisfaction of a complex problem cleanly and efficiently solved. The liability had been transferred. The hostile element had been quarantined. The integrity of the Sinclair Trust was secure. Julian Marshall wanted to fight me in the courtroom and in the press. I had engineered it so that he would be too busy fighting with my daughter over the price of groceries to ever be a threat to me again. It was a perfect, elegant checkmate. The months passed and the silence from Lena's new world was absolute. My initial satisfaction at the success of my strategy slowly solidified into a new stable status quo. The family, now streamlined and more focused, functioned with greater efficiency. My son Marcus stepped seamlessly into the role of the undisputed heir. His loyalty and ambition now sharpened by his sister's spectacular fall from grace. He was more dedicated, more ruthless, more like me. The business thrived. The empire was secure. Life returned to its managed, predictable rhythms: board meetings, philanthropic galas, strategic acquisitions. I moved through my world with the same serene, unshakable composure as always. Lena was a closed chapter, a historical footnote in the grand, ongoing narrative of the Sinclair legacy. Then, one evening in late spring, I attended a charity ball for the city's art museum. It was an event I had chaired for a decade. As I was making my way through the glittering crowd, a business associate, a real estate developer named Thomas Walton, stopped me by the champagne fountain. "Vivian, wonderful to see you," he said, his smile a little too wide. "Magnificent event as always. Tell me, how is your daughter Lena? My wife and I were just saying we haven't seen her on the scene in ages." The question was a small, social grenade, tossed casually into my path. Walton was a competitor, a rival. His inquiry was not born of genuine concern. It was a probe, a search for a crack in the Sinclair facade. I gave him my most polished, disarming smile. "Lena is wonderful, Thomas," I replied, my voice smooth as ice. "She's decided to step back from the public eye for a while. She's embracing a more bohemian path, finding her own way. You know how passionate these young artists can be. I'm immensely proud of her independence." It was a perfect, airtight response. It acknowledged her absence, framed it as a choice, and painted me as the supportive modern parent. It gave him nothing. He nodded, his curiosity sated, and moved on. The rest of the evening proceeded without incident. I smiled. I networked. I wrote a 7-figure check for a new museum wing. I performed my role flawlessly. But later that night, back in the silence of my office, the question lingered. I was reviewing the quarterly reports for the trust, the numbers glowing on my screen. a testament to a year of unprecedented growth, but my focus wavered. My gaze drifted to a small silver-framed photograph on a side table, partially obscured by a stack of architectural plans. I walked over and picked it up. I hadn't looked at it in years. It was a picture of me and Lena, taken on a sailing trip in the Greek Isles. She was 5 years old, perched on my shoulders, her small hands tangled in my hair. Her face was thrown back in a fit of unrestrained, joyous laughter. My own face, younger and softer, was smiling up at her, a genuine, uncalculated smile of pure maternal love. I stared at the image, at the ghost of the woman I had been, at the ghost of the child she had been, and for the first time in a very, very long time, a crack appeared in the marble facade of my composure. It was not a feeling of regret. Regret is an unproductive emotion. It was an acknowledgement of cost. To build an empire, sacrifices are required. I had known that from the beginning. I had sacrificed my time, my personal life, my sentimentality. I had made 1,000 difficult, necessary decisions. The decision regarding Lena was simply the largest, the most absolute. It was a strategic amputation, cutting off a diseased limb to save the body. The logic was sound. The outcome was optimal. But staring at that photograph, I was forced to confront the stark, silent reality of what had been lost. I had secured the legacy, but I had lost the laugh. I had protected the future of the empire, but I had erased a piece of its past, and a piece of my own. A flicker of profound, unexpected loss, as sharp and cold as a shard of ice, pierced through my armor. It was a data point I could not quantify, an emotional variable I could not control. With a steady hand, I placed the photograph face down on the table. I returned to my desk, to the comforting, absolute certainty of the numbers on my screen. The empire was secure. The legacy was safe. That was the only metric that mattered. The only one I would allow to matter. 1 year later, the scene was a perfect echo, a refined and purified version of the one that had preceded it. It was Christmas Day. The mahogany dining table was set with the same geometric precision, the crystal gleaming, the silverware a silent army awaiting its command. The house was filled with the scent of pine and roasting goose. But the system was different. It was more streamlined, more efficient. The extraneous relatives, the cousins and their spouses who added little to the Sinclair balance sheet, had not been invited this year. The guest list had been optimized. Lena's chair was gone. Its absence was not a gaping wound, but a seamless correction. The table had been reset for a smaller number, the spacing between the remaining chairs mathematically perfect. It was as if she had never been there at all. My son Marcus sat at my right hand. He had flown in from Singapore the night before, having successfully closed the acquisition of a major shipping conglomerate. He was thinner than he had been a year ago, his face harder, his eyes holding the cool, calculating gaze of a man who understood power. He had spent the year proving his worth, his loyalty, his absolute commitment to the family, the real family. The final transfer should be complete by the time the markets open in New York, he was saying, his voice a low, confident murmur. Their board capitulated completely. We got them for a 30% discount on their actual valuation. Excellent work, Marcus, I said, inclining my head in a gesture of approval. You've done well. Our conversation was not small talk. It was a status report, a confirmation of the continued growth and strength of our empire. This was the proper subject for a family dinner. This was a conversation of shared purpose, of legacy. My phone, resting beside my plate, vibrated with a soft, discreet buzz. I glanced at the screen. It was a sterile, automated notification from the bank that managed the trust. The subject line read, Tertiary Beneficiary Annual Stipend, Disbursement Confirmation. It was the court-mandated payment to Lena. A small, insulting sum, a legal necessity to forestall any future claims, a digital crumb from the groaning feast of our table. I read the subject line and without opening the message, without any curiosity as to the amount or the details, my thumb swiped across the screen and pressed delete. The notification vanished. My attention returned to Marcus, to the discussion of shipping lanes and tariff avoidance strategies. The interruption was forgotten. A piece of irrelevant data, a spam email from a life I no longer lived. The dinner proceeded with a calm, quiet, ruthless efficiency. We ate. We strategized, we consolidated our power. The Sinclair Trust had had its most profitable year on record. Our wealth had grown. Our influence had expanded. Our position was unassailable. The family was smaller, but it was stronger. It was pure. It was a perfect, self-sustaining system, cleansed of all weakness, all sentiment, all dissent. It was a monument not to ego but to a simple, unyielding principle. The legacy is all that matters. I looked across the table at my son, my true heir, his face illuminated by the candlelight. He was a reflection of me, the future of my vision. The system was functioning perfectly. The succession was secure. The empire was safe. And in the cold, quiet perfection of that moment, I felt something that passed for peace. Thank you for watching.